My name is Marian Whitaker. I am 68 years old, a retired librarian who once believed the shelves of books I tended were the most enduring thing in my life. I had one son, Ethan, and after my husband Robert passed away, all of my love, my energy, my savings flowed toward that boy. He was my reason for waking up each morning. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment I asked Ethan and his fiancée about their engagement. I had expected joy. I had expected to be included. I had even pressed a soft question, smiling the way mothers do when they're trying not to intrude. So, when is the engagement party? That was when Brooke, my future daughter-in-law, looked right at me. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a laugh. "Oh, we celebrated last weekend. Invite only." The words cut through me like glass. Invite only. A party had already happened, a celebration of the union of my only child, and I had not even been considered worthy of a chair in the corner. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stood in my kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself, while Ethan's eyes darted away, his silence louder than Brooke's taunt. She reached into her phone with a little flourish and showed me pictures. Brooke in a white dress, her parents beaming, champagne flutes raised high, her siblings encircling them in joy, all the Carter family. Not a trace of me. I felt my stomach twist when I recognized the dress. A soft blue silk one that I had bought for her months earlier, telling myself it would look perfect for a future engagement dinner. I had chosen it carefully, tucked it into a box, wrapped it with tissue, and there she was, dazzling in the very thing I had gifted, while I was cut out of the frame, cut out of the memory. My eyes traveled back to Ethan, my boy who once climbed onto my lap when storms scared him, pressing his cheek against mine and whispering that I was his safe place. That same boy now adjusted his tie nervously, unable to meet my eyes. I thought of his little hands clutching mine on his first day of school, his wide grin when I cheered for him at his soccer games. How could that child grow into this man who let his fiancée humiliate me without a word? In that silence, Brooke's voice filled the air again. She laughed, a light, almost dismissive laugh, and tapped another picture. It was perfect. Just family. Just the right people. Her tone made it clear. I was not the right people. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded slowly, swallowing the bitter taste rising in my throat. My hands trembled, and I folded them together so neither of them would see. My own son didn't defend me, didn't correct her, didn't insist that I should have been there. He simply let the words hang. Later that night, I sat in my room staring at the pale green dress I had bought for myself, the one I imagined wearing with pride when Ethan announced his engagement. It still had the tags on. I had pictured photographs where I would stand next to him, proud and glowing. Instead, I was invisible. But humiliation wasn't done with me yet. A few days later, my phone chimed. A message from Brooke. "The keys to your 1.3 Emma beach house don't fit. Did you send the wrong ones?" For a moment, I just stared at the screen, unable to process the audacity. She had not only excluded me, she now presumed access to the home my husband and I had poured decades of savings into. A house by the shore that held every memory of summer vacations, of Ethan learning to swim, of Robert grilling fish on the porch. My fingers hovered over the phone. I thought of the quiet nights Robert and I had spent in that house, talking about our future, about keeping it safe for retirement, about handing it down when the time was right. Brooke's presumption that it was already hers to enter was almost laughable if it hadn't been so cruel. So I typed slowly, deliberately. "Wait, you didn't know?" I hit send, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of control returning to me. If you have ever felt left out of the very moments you should have belonged to, if you've ever carried the weight of sacrifices unseen, stay with me. This is not just a story of betrayal. It is a story of reclaiming, of quiet strength, and of finding the courage to stand up when silence has gone on too long. Because that night, as I stared at the glow of my phone and the arrogance behind Brooke's words, I realized something. The woman I used to be, the one who bent over backward to please, who paid every bill, who smiled through humiliation, she was gone. And the woman who took her place was about to remember exactly who she was. I stood in my bedroom that evening, the air heavy with the silence of a house that once brimmed with life. My eyes drifted to the closet where, behind neatly pressed blouses and cardigans, hung the pale green dress I had chosen months ago. I slid the door open slowly, almost as if I was afraid the truth would hit me harder once I looked straight at it. The fabric shimmered faintly under the soft light. I had imagined it on me, imagined Ethan smiling proudly as he introduced his mother at the engagement party, imagined photographs with me standing next to him as if I still mattered. But there it hung, untouched, tag still dangling from the sleeve, proof that all my imagining was nothing but a foolish dream. I reached out and ran my fingers over the smooth material. It felt cold against my skin. That dress was not just fabric. It was my hope sewn into seams, my longing folded into every crease. I remembered how carefully I had chosen it. I had spent 3 afternoons walking from store to store, looking for something elegant, but not too loud, respectable but not old-fashioned. When I finally found it, I told myself, this will be perfect for Ethan's big day. I had paid $200, money I could have used on bills or groceries, but I didn't hesitate. That day, it didn't feel like an expense. It felt like an investment in belonging. As I stared at the dress, shame burned inside me. What kind of mother buys herself a place in her child's life with fabric and thread? Yet wasn't that what I had been doing for years? I had bought them furniture when they couldn't afford a couch, stocked their refrigerator when their paychecks ran out before the month ended, paid for repairs on their car so Ethan could get to work. I even handed Brooke envelopes of cash, thinly veiled as gifts, when she complained about expenses. I thought generosity would build bridges, but all it did was teach them that my love came with an open wallet. I sank onto the edge of the bed and covered my face with my hands. My mind wandered back to the day Ethan called me with the news that he was proposing. My heart had swelled with such joy. I had dialed my sister Nora that evening, hardly able to contain myself. "Nora, you won't believe it," I had said, clutching the phone as if my excitement could travel through the line. "Ethan is getting engaged. I'm finally going to be part of something beautiful again." Nora had laughed, her warm, familiar laugh. "Marion, you deserve this. You've carried so much alone since Robert passed. It's about time Joy found you." I had nodded through tears, believing her. I even told her I was planning to give Ethan and Brooke $1,000 as a gift, something to start their life together. I never told her how I was skipping my own medical checkups, postponing fixing the leaky roof, tightening every corner of my budget to make it possible. I had cleaned the house top to bottom, dusting shelves, polishing picture frames, rearranging flowers on the dining table, imagining Ethan and Brooke stopping by after the celebration. I pictured laughter spilling into the rooms, the sound of glasses clinking, and me sitting quietly in the corner, watching my son step into adulthood with pride. Instead, the rooms echoed with absence. The flowers wilted before anyone saw them, and the silence mocked me with every passing day. The numbers started to stack up in my mind as I sat there. $500 a month in rent for 2 years, $12,000. Groceries when they were short, at least $2,000 more. Furniture, gifts, medical bills, maybe another $5,000. More than $19,000 chipped away from my savings, my pension, and the inheritance Robert had left me. $19,000 in exchange for exclusion from the one moment I thought I had earned. The realization pressed down on me, heavy as lead. I had invested almost everything I had into their comfort, believing it would secure my place in their hearts. Instead, I had paid for my own erasure. I let my hand fall from the dress and sat back, closing my eyes. Images of Ethan as a boy came rushing to me, him running across the yard barefoot, calling out, "Mom, watch me," as he climbed trees. Him falling asleep with his head on my shoulder after reading bedtime stories. Him asking if we could make pancakes on Saturday mornings, his laughter filling the kitchen. Those memories lived in me like treasures, but they were covered now with the dust of what he had become. A man who looked at me like an obligation, whose silence cut sharper than any insult. I whispered his name into the emptiness, Ethan, hoping somehow the child I once knew could hear me through time. But only the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs answered back. I pulled the closet door shut, leaving the green dress behind, and sat there in the dim light. I had thought that dress would mark my entrance into a new chapter of family. Instead, it became a monument to a truth I couldn't ignore anymore. No matter what I gave, it was never going to be enough for them to see me as special. A week passed after the engagement revelation, but the sting of those words, "invite only," still echoed in my chest. I moved through the days like a ghost in my own house, making coffee in the morning, washing the same dishes, folding the same laundry, all with a hollowness that was new to me. I thought the silence would give me peace, but it only reminded me of how quickly a mother can become disposable. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, the phone rang. I hesitated before answering. The caller ID showed Brooke's name. My first instinct was to let it ring out, but a lifetime of habit, of being the one who always showed up when needed, made me pick it up. Her voice surprised me. It wasn't smug or triumphant like the last time we spoke. It was trembling, fragile, threaded with desperation. "Marion," she began, "the rent is overdue. You forgot." For a moment I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I had not forgotten. For 3 years I had never once forgotten. Every month I made the transfer like clockwork. $500, rent for the apartment where my son and his fiancée lived, rent for a place where I was barely welcome to sit on the couch I had bought. I had remembered when I was sick, when I was tired, when I had my own bills mounting. But now she spoke to me as if the burden was mine to carry still, as if forgetting their rent was the same as forgetting my own heartbeat. My silence stretched long enough for her to grow more anxious. "The landlord is threatening to evict us," she continued, her words spilling faster. "And Ethan is working late shifts. We counted on you. I thought you already made the payment." Her words were like matches thrown onto a pile of dry leaves inside me. Counted on me. Of course they did. They always did. My mind swirled back through the endless sacrifices, the times I skipped my own dental appointments because Ethan needed help with his car loan, the months I lived on beans and rice so Brooke could buy a new dress for a dinner party, the quiet withdrawals from my savings when they wanted to take a vacation but couldn't afford airfare. Every time they leaned on me, I told myself it was temporary, that one day they would stand on their own 2 feet. Instead, I had trained them to see me as a safety net they didn't even have to thank. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear and took a deep breath. "Brooke," I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. "I didn't forget." There was a pause, just long enough for her to catch the sharpness in my tone. "Then why?" Her voice cracked. "Why hasn't it been paid?" I closed my eyes. In that moment, I remembered the sting of standing in my kitchen while she told me I wasn't invited to the engagement celebration. I remembered Ethan's averted gaze. I remembered the photographs she flaunted, proof that I had been erased. Something inside me that had been fragile for years suddenly solidified into steel. "Because," I said slowly, letting each word fall with weight, "I only help special people." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could almost hear her mind racing, the realization slamming into her that I had turned her own cruelty back on her. Her breath hitched. "Marion, I don't understand," she stammered. "We're family. You've always said we were special to you." Her words might have broken me once. I might have rushed to reassure her, to excuse her behavior, to hand over money just to buy back the illusion of belonging. But not this time. I let the quiet linger, savoring the shift in power that came not from shouting or anger, but from restraint. "You told me I wasn't special enough to be at your engagement," I replied evenly. "So forgive me if I no longer see our arrangement the same way." She started to cry then, but I knew those tears. They were not tears of regret or love. They were tears of frustration, the kind a child cries when their toy is taken away. She tried again, her voice soft and sugary, a tone I had heard countless times when she wanted something. "Marion, you've always been like a second mom to me. I don't know what we'll do without you." I felt no warmth at her words, only a clarity that settled into my bones. How many times had I fallen for that line? How many times had I let second mom blind me to the truth that I was nothing more than a bank account with feelings? Her flattery no longer worked. I had opened my eyes, and there was no closing them now. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said calmly. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't waver. I thought of Robert and how hard he had worked to leave me enough to live comfortably in my later years. I thought of the green dress in my closet, unworn, mocking me with every glance. I thought of little Ethan, who once clung to my hand, and the man he had become, who now avoided my eyes while his fiancée cut me out of his life. "I have to go," I told her, and before she could reply, I ended the call. I set the phone down on the table and stared at it. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a strange exhilaration. For the first time in years, I had said no. I had not shouted, I had not pleaded, I had simply spoken the truth, and the world had not collapsed around me. In fact, the house felt lighter, the air clearer. I knew this was only the beginning. They would come back, with more pleas, more tricks, more pressure. But I had taken the first step, and in that moment, in the quiet that followed, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe in a long time. I was stronger than they imagined, stronger than even I had imagined. That night, after the call with Brooke, I sat at the dining room table with a notebook and a pen. The house was still, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock above the door. I spread out old bank statements and receipts, the quiet paper trail of years I could no longer ignore. If they wanted to pretend my contributions were small, if they wanted to erase me, then I would see for myself exactly what I had given. I wrote rent at the top of the page, $500 a month for 2 years straight. I calculated it carefully, 24 months, $12,000. I paused, staring at the number, 12,000. That alone could have fixed the roof, taken me on a trip I always told myself I didn't deserve, or covered the health screenings I kept postponing. Instead, it bought me absence from a party I should have been part of. Next, I wrote groceries. My mind flashed to the countless bags I had carried up to their apartment. Milk, bread, meat, fruits, vegetables, always filling their refrigerator, always smiling when Brooke would sigh with relief. It was never one big gesture, just 50 here, 70 there, but over time it built into something heavy. I estimated at least $2,000 in 2 years. My pen moved slower as I wrote the number, a lump forming in my throat. Utilities, I scribbled next. There had been 3 separate times when their electricity bill had been cut off, and Ethan called me in a panic. I had covered it each time, 150, 200, another 100, 500 total. I remembered Brooke's teary voice thanking me, promising they'd pay me back. That promise dissolved like smoke, never spoken of again. I wrote car repair. Ethan's old sedan had broken down more than once. Twice I had handed over my credit card. Once for $600, once for nearly $1,000. Another time, Brooke had convinced me to cover new tires. $1,800 in total. I remembered sitting in the waiting area of the mechanic shop, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching as Ethan paced, embarrassed. I had told him it was fine, that parents were supposed to help their children. I had believed it then. Then came gifts, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. I thought of the necklace I had bought Brooke one Christmas, a delicate gold chain that cost $400, the watch for Ethan's 30th birthday, nearly $600. Little things, countless little things, candles, clothing, shoes, dinners out, no less than $3,000 altogether. I paused and leaned back in the chair, staring at the growing list. My pen shook slightly in my hand. I pressed on. Medical. I remembered the night Ethan called, saying Brooke had broken a tooth and the dental work would be too expensive. I had covered it, $700. Then there was the urgent care visit when Ethan injured his hand at work, another $500. All told, $1,200. Finally, vacations. That one hurt the most. They had wanted to go to Florida, but couldn't afford flights. I gave them $1,800, pretending it was a gift for both of them. I stayed home, alone, looking at the photographs they sent from the beach, Brooke's smile wide, Ethan's arm wrapped around her. I was glad for them at the time. Now, writing it down, I felt foolish. I added the numbers carefully, double-checking each column as Robert used to do when balancing our household budget. $12,000 for rent, $2,000 for groceries, $500 for utilities, $1,800 for car repairs, $3,000 for gifts, $1,200 for medical, $1,800 for vacations, $33,400. The figure stared back at me from the page, cold and unfeeling. $33,400. I whispered it aloud, as if saying it would make it more real. That was nearly 2 years of my pension. That was security I had given away, piece by piece, in the hope of being seen as irreplaceable in their lives. I closed my eyes and suddenly, Robert's face came to me. I saw him as he had been the last year of his life, sitting at this very table, explaining the accounts to me with such care. "I want you safe, Marion," he had said, his hand covering mine. "Promise me you won't let anyone take advantage of this. It's for you. You worked as hard as I did to build this." He had looked so serious, so protective. And yet, here I was, turning his legacy into their lifeline. Not because I was reckless, but because I thought that giving was the same as loving. I thought that providing was the only way left for me to matter. I had not been a mother, not in the way I wanted to be. I had been a vault, a silent keeper of resources. They didn't come to me for advice or comfort. They came to me with bills in hand. I opened my eyes and stared at the sum again. $33,400. The number seemed to etch itself into the air around me. I felt heat rise in my chest, anger curling at the edges of grief. It wasn't just money. It was years of my life, my health, my peace, converted into digits that meant nothing to them. I set the pen down and pressed my palms flat against the table. My breath came out slow, deliberate. For the first time, I allowed myself to name what had happened. I had been used. Not cherished, not honored, not celebrated. Used. Robert's voice echoed in my memory. "Promise me you'll protect yourself." Tears filled my eyes, but behind them was something steadier, harder. Maybe I had broken that promise once, but I would not break it again. I closed the notebook, slid it into the drawer, and sat back in the quiet. The numbers would not change, but perhaps I could. And maybe that was what Robert had meant all along, that safety wasn't just about dollars and cents. It was about remembering my own worth before anyone else erased it. I was washing a stack of dishes in the sink when my phone buzzed on the counter. The message came from Brooke. I dried my hands slowly, bracing myself, because her words never arrived without a demand tied to them. I opened it and read, "The keys to your 1.3M beach house don't fit. Did you send the wrong ones?" I read the sentence twice, then a third time, each pass twisting my stomach tighter. My beach house, the one Robert and I had worked decades to pay off, the one we bought as a sanctuary by the shore when we finally allowed ourselves to dream a little. Every summer, Ethan learned to swim there, chasing waves while Robert grilled fish on the porch. That house held my most tender memories, the ones that kept me alive through grief. And now, Brooke wrote as if it were hers, as if she had already slid into ownership like slipping on a pair of shoes. The absurdity almost made me laugh. I had never given anyone a key. Not Ethan, not Brooke, not anyone. That house was mine, the last place untouched by their demands. For her to stand in front of a locked door and assume the problem was me, it was almost poetic. She didn't ask if she could have it. She simply asked why her key didn't work, as though access was already her right. For a moment, my chest burned with fury. The memory of all I had given, $33,000 and more, flashed in my mind. Now she wanted the crown jewel. They had excluded me from the engagement, drained my savings, treated me as a bystander in my own family, and still they felt entitled to more. But as I stared at the glowing message, the fury began to cool. Beneath it rose something steadier, sharper. I let my thumb hover over the screen. Words formed slowly, carefully. "Wait, you didn't know?" I hit send and set the phone down, leaning back in my chair. The silence in the room thickened, filled with the weight of that unanswered question. I knew it would rattle her. She thought she held all the pieces, that Ethan's loyalty and my history of giving meant the house would eventually be hers. But she didn't know. She didn't know what Robert and I had arranged years ago. She didn't know that trust documents existed, drawn up with quiet precision, that safeguarded certain things from greedy hands. She didn't know that the beach house was more than property. It was a promise, and one I intended to keep. The phone buzzed again. This time her words were frantic. "What do you mean?" Ethan said. Then another bubble appeared, cutting her off. "Didn't you already put it in his name?" I stared at the screen, and for the first time in months, a strange calm washed over me. Brooke's confusion was a gift. It showed me exactly how they thought of me, not as a mother, not as a woman who had built a life with her husband, but as a stepping stone to assets. They thought my role was already finished, my existence reduced to a transfer of deeds. They believed in a story where my identity vanished once Ethan signed on the dotted line. I thought of Robert again, of his voice the night we signed the papers on that house. "This place," he had said, his hand on mine, "is for peace. No one will take it from you. Not even Ethan, if he forgets who you are." His foresight startled me back then, but now it felt like prophecy. He had known the world could turn cold, that even blood ties could sour. I typed again, my fingers steady. Some houses aren't as easy to claim as you think. I didn't explain further. I didn't owe her clarity. Let her wonder. Let her ask Ethan questions he couldn't answer. Let her realize there were corners of my life she couldn't touch. The 3 dots blinked, then disappeared. No reply came. I imagined her standing there, key in hand, rattling a door that would not open, realizing for the first time that not everything was hers to take. I set the phone aside and walked to the window. Outside, the evening sky glowed faintly pink, the same color it had been on summer nights at the beach house when Robert and I sat side by side on the porch. I closed my eyes and breathed in the memory of salt air, the sound of Ethan's boyish laughter echoing across the waves. That place was sacred. It was not theirs to seize, no matter what they believed. I realized then that their arrogance was my shield. They had underestimated me so deeply they couldn't see the ground shifting beneath their feet. They thought they knew every line of the story, but the ending had already been written differently, years ago. I turned from the window and smiled faintly. Let them scramble. Let them argue over keys that would never fit. I had nothing to prove, only patience to wait. Because the truth was, Brooke hadn't just revealed her greed in that message. She had reminded me that I was not powerless. I held more than they could imagine, and I had only begun to remember what that meant. The morning after Brooke's message about the beach house, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The air felt lighter somehow, and though my body was still stiff from age and sleepless nights, my mind was sharper than it had been in a long time. I knew what needed to be done. For too long I had carried Ethan and Brooke on my back, funding their lives as if that were my duty, as if love had to be measured in deposits and withdrawals. That morning, I told myself the truth out loud. It had to stop. I dressed simply, a navy cardigan over a white blouse, and drove into town. My hands gripped the wheel firmly, not trembling as they so often did when I thought about confrontation. Today was not about begging, not about explaining. It was about reclaiming. The bank sat on the corner of Main Street, a brick building I had walked into countless times with a sense of responsibility. Today, I walked in with resolve. Raj, the banker who had helped me for years, looked up from his desk and smiled in surprise when he saw me. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said warmly, rising to shake my hand. "We don't see you in here often anymore. How are you?" "I've been better," I replied honestly, taking the seat across from him. I set my purse down, folded my hands over it, and leaned forward. "Raj, I need to cancel every automatic transfer from my account to Ethan and Brooke Carter's account, effective immediately." His eyebrows shot up, and for a moment he looked as though he hadn't heard me correctly. "Cancel everything?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Every monthly transfer, every standing order. It ends today." He hesitated, then nodded slowly and began tapping at his computer. "Of course, Mrs. Whitaker. It's just that, well, you've had those transfers set up for quite some time. May I ask what's changed?" I met his eyes, steady and calm. I finally opened my eyes. Raj froze for a beat, then gave a small nod as if he understood more than he let on. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. I watched the lines of numbers on the screen shift as he pulled up the details of my account. All those transfers laid bare, the rent, the lump sums, the little extras. Together, they formed a portrait of years spent bleeding myself dry in the name of love. "You know," Raj said carefully, "I shouldn't tell you this, but maybe it's important. A few months ago, Brooke called the bank. She asked for access to your account, said she was handling family finances now." My breath caught in my throat. "She what?" "She tried to present herself as your power of attorney," Raj explained, lowering his voice. "Of course, we couldn't give her anything. She didn't have the documents, and even if she had, we'd have contacted you first. But it was persistent. She called twice, said you'd just forgotten to put her name down." I gripped the edge of the desk. The audacity was staggering, but it also made something inside me harden like stone. So this hadn't been about help or kindness for a long time. It had been about control, about weaving herself into the heart of my security. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly, though my chest burned. "That confirms everything I needed to know." Raj studied me for a moment, then gave a small smile, not unkind. "You're stronger than you think, Mrs. Whitaker. Not many people come in here and cut ties like this." "I should have done it years ago," I admitted, my voice catching just slightly. "But I thought giving meant I was still needed. I thought if I kept them afloat, I wouldn't drown in loneliness." I see now I was wrong. He printed out a document and slid it across the desk. "Oh, if you sign here, that'll be the end of it." I took the pen in my hand and stared at the line for a long moment. Signing my name had never felt so symbolic. I thought of Robert again, the way he used to rest his hand on mine when we balanced the checkbook, how he always said, "We're building something for us, Marion." I thought of his warning not to let anyone take what we had worked for. I lowered the pen to the paper and signed with steady strokes. Raj took the form, stamped it, and handed me a copy. "All done," he said. "From today forward, nothing leaves your account without your say-so." A weight lifted from my shoulders, so heavy I hadn't realized how much it bent me. I sat straighter in the chair, breathing easier. The thought of Ethan and Brooke checking their account at the end of the month and finding nothing there filled me with a quiet satisfaction. Not spite, not cruelty, just balance being restored. As I left the bank, the autumn sun warmed my face, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a caretaker of other people's lives. I felt like my own guardian. Their dependence on me had ended with a signature, and though I knew they wouldn't accept it quietly, though I knew storms were still ahead, I also knew I had crossed a threshold. I walked back to my car, slipped into the driver's seat, and gripped the wheel again. The same hands that had trembled a week ago when Brooke said, "Invite only," now rested steady and strong. I whispered into the stillness, not to Raj, not to Brooke, not even to Ethan, but to myself. I finally opened my eyes. They arrived just after noon, when the light in my living room was widest and least forgiving. I heard the keys scrape at the front door, the heavy click of the deadbolt, and then Ethan's voice, soft and uncertain, calling my name as if he had simply come home. I stood from the kitchen table and met them in the hall, Ethan first, Brooke at his shoulder, and behind them a woman with Brooke's sharp cheekbones and colder eyes. Sloan. A man in a gray suit followed last, polished shoes, legal pad tucked beneath his arm, a smile that felt like a warning. "Mom," Ethan said, the word landing in the air between us like a coin that should have been worth more. "We need to talk. It's important." "I didn't invite you," I replied, stepping back just enough to make them aware that I had noticed the trespass. "But since you're here, speak." The man in the suit moved forward with a practiced gentleness. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Mr. Fisher. I represent your family's interests. We're only here to make sure you're protected." "Protected from what?" I asked. Brooke slipped past Ethan and perched on the arm of my sofa, as if it belonged to her. "From stress, from confusion, from making decisions that aren't in your best interest." Her eyes swept over the room, assessing pictures, the antique clock, the neat stacks of books. She smiled like a realtor. "You've been under a lot lately. We thought we'd help with some paperwork." Sloan set a leather folder on my dining table and opened it with ceremony. "It's quite simple," she said. "A durable power of attorney, updated beneficiaries, joint access for Ethan so he can handle bills if you're tired. We all want you to feel secure." "I am secure," I said. Mr. Fisher slid a pen toward me. "This just formalizes what's already happening. You've always helped Ethan. Let's take the pressure off you. One signature, and he can take care of things. You won't have to worry about transfers, due dates, any of it." I stared at the pen without touching it. "I canceled the transfers yesterday," I said, my voice even. "There's nothing left to manage." Ethan flinched. Brooke's jaw tightened. Sloan's smile vanished and then returned, thinner. "That's exactly why we're here. Sudden decisions can be a sign of strain. You've been forgetful, Marion, missing appointments, making impulsive choices." "I missed nothing," I said. "I changed my mind." Mr. Fisher laced his fingers together. "Your family's concerned. If you prefer, we can have a doctor evaluate things, purely routine. But the simplest solution is to sign these forms so Ethan can step in. If we delay, the court may require something more formal." "The court?" I asked. "A guardianship," he said softly, as if speaking to a frightened child. "Only if necessary." Ethan finally found his voice. "Mom, please. It's not what it sounds like. We just need to smooth things out. The landlord's been calling. The car insurance is due. Everything's piling up." "And your engagement party was invite only," I said. "Your memory seems selective." He stared at the floor. Brooke leaned forward, her tone syrupy. "Let's not rehash the past. We're trying to fix the future. You'll be comfortable. You won't have to worry about your beach house or this place or anything. We'll take care of it. That's what families do." "Families do not break into each other's homes," I replied. Sloane's voice cooled a degree. "He has a key." "He had a key," I said. "You used it without asking. That's trespassing." Mr. Fisher lifted the pen again. "Please, one signature. It saves everyone pain." I looked at Ethan. His face had the washed-out color he used to have when he came down with a fever as a boy. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I breathed in and out, steadying. "No," I said. A stillness fell over the room. Brooke exhaled through her nose, then stood and walked to the table. "You don't mean that." "I do." "Marion," she said, voice dropping the sweetness, "be realistic. Everything you have will belong to us one day anyway." The sentence struck me like a hard, clean slap. I felt the old ache rise in my chest and watched, almost as an observer, as it hardened into something colder. I reached for the folder and opened it. Pages slid beneath my fingers, dense paragraphs, highlighted lines, signature tabs peeking out like yellow flags. I picked up the sheaf, weighed it, then walked to the trash can by the kitchen counter and dropped the entire packet in. Paper settled on plastic with a sound too light for what it meant. Sloane's composure cracked. "That was unwise." "On the contrary," I said, "it was overdue." Mr. Fisher's smile disappeared. "Mrs. Whitaker, I must advise you that if you refuse reasonable measures, your family is within their rights to petition the court. Judges can and do appoint guardians when an elder's decision-making becomes erratic." "Because I decided to keep my own money?" "Because you've displayed instability," Brooke interjected. "You're isolating. You're lashing out. You're not thinking clearly." "I am thinking more clearly than I have in years." Ethan took a step toward me, palms up. "Mom, we're just trying to help. Please don't make this harder." "Hard was standing in my kitchen while your fiancé told me I wasn't invited to your engagement," I said. "Hard was watching you say nothing." He closed his eyes, shame flickering across his features, and then it was gone, swallowed by fear. Sloane gathered her purse, composed again. "Fine," she said. "We'll let the court decide. For your sake, I hope they're merciful." Mr. Fisher tore a card from his folder and set it on the table as if leaving a condolence note. "You'll hear from us," he said. "Think about calling me before this escalates. It could save you trouble." I walked them to the door without another word. Brooke paused at the threshold and glanced back into my living room like a tourist memorizing a museum piece. "You can't keep us out forever," she said quietly. "Doors open." "Only to the right keys," I replied. They were halfway down the walk when I called after them. "Next time, use the doorbell." Ethan turned, searching my face for softness, for any sign of the mother who always relented. He found none. He lowered his head and followed the others to the car. The engine started. The sound receded. Silence spread through the house, not empty, but clean. I stood in the hall and let my heart beat slow. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the release that comes when a boundary finally holds. I walked back to the kitchen, lifted the trash can lid, and looked down at the stack of papers. A small laugh escaped me, quiet, disbelieving. Then I pressed the pedal and watched the lid close. I made tea and carried the cup to the table where the gray ring of sunlight traveled across the wood. I held the warm ceramic in both hands and let the heat seep into my fingers. The air smelled faintly of lemon and soap. Outside, a breeze shook the maple leaves and their shadows rippled over the floor like water. I sat very still and listened to the house breathe. They would not quit. I knew that. There would be calls, messages, accusations dressed as concern. There might be a stranger at my door with a clipboard, asking questions in a kind voice. But something had shifted inside me. I had said no and meant it. I had watched the old pattern fall into a bin where it belonged. I took a slow sip and let the tea warm my chest. Somewhere deep in my mind, Robert's voice surfaced, steady and amused. "That's my girl." I smiled into the cup, and the house, my house, felt like mine again. The morning after they stormed into my house, I sat at the kitchen table with my tea gone cold and the memory of their voices still clawing at the walls. Brooke's words, "Everything you have will belong to us one day anyway," replayed like a taunt. I knew they weren't finished. They would come back, maybe with more papers, maybe with a petition, maybe with lies. I was not naive enough to think standing my ground once would make them retreat. That was when I realized I could not fight this alone. I pulled out the worn leather address book Robert had kept in the desk drawer. My eyes fell on a name I had never once called but had often remembered. Daniel Adler. Robert's old friend, a lawyer who had helped us once with estate planning years ago. I dialed the number, half expecting it to be disconnected after all this time. But a calm voice answered, "Adler Law." "This is Marian Whitaker," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need your help." Within an hour, I was sitting in Daniel's office downtown. It smelled faintly of books and cedar polish, and the walls were lined with shelves of legal texts. Daniel himself was older than I remembered, his hair now more silver than brown, but his eyes were the same, clear, watchful, and kind. He leaned back in his chair, listening as I poured out everything: the engagement exclusion, the rent payments, the beach house, the papers they tried to force on me, and Brooke's threat. When I finished, his jaw tightened. He tapped his pen once against his legal pad and said, "Marian, what you're describing is elder financial abuse." The words sank into me like stones. Abuse. I had danced around the word for so long, convincing myself that family loyalty excused everything, that sacrifice was simply my role. Hearing him call it by its true name made my stomach clench, but it also gave me something solid to hold on to. "They'll escalate," Daniel continued. "It almost always does. You've stopped the money, so they'll try to undermine your credibility. They may file for guardianship, claim you're not competent to handle your own affairs. The fact that they came into your home with a lawyer tells me they're already preparing for that route." "I'm not incompetent," I said, heat rising in my voice. "I know," he said quickly, raising a hand. "But the court doesn't know you. Judges need proof. And people like Brooke and Sloan are banking on the assumption that you won't fight back. That's where I come in. But Marian, you need to do more than say no. You need to build a wall they can't climb." "What kind of wall?" I asked. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though we were alone. "First, change the locks. Don't let them stroll into your house again. Second, install cameras. Document every interaction. If they show up with accusations, you'll have evidence of their behavior, not just your word. Third, keep a written log. Dates, times, what was said. Small details matter in court. Consistency will protect you." I took notes as he spoke, my handwriting shaky but legible. "Locks, cameras, records," I repeated, committing it to memory. "And one more thing," Daniel said. "You'll need witnesses outside the family. People who can vouch for your mental clarity and your independence. Neighbors, friends, anyone in the community who sees you functioning normally. If Brooke tries to paint you as confused or unstable, their testimony will carry weight. The thought of involving others made me uncomfortable. I had lived quietly since Robert's passing, polite with neighbors, but never leaning on them. "I don't want to burden anyone," I murmured. "You won't burden them," Daniel said firmly. "You'll give them a chance to stand beside you. Most people hate seeing this kind of exploitation. They'll want to help." I sat back in the chair, the reality of it pressing on me. Witnesses, logs, surveillance, these were things people used in court battles, not in family disagreements. Yet here I was, forced to defend myself against my own blood. I closed my eyes for a moment and saw Robert's face, his steady hand on mine the day he warned me to protect myself. Maybe he had seen this coming all along. Daniel's voice softened. "You are not alone in this, Marion. I'll represent you, but I need you to be strong. Every time you feel doubt, remember what they've already done. Remember that their goal is to strip you of your autonomy. If you let them, they'll succeed. If you fight, you can keep everything you've built." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll fight," I said. When I left his office, the late afternoon sun was low in the sky, painting the buildings in amber light. I clutched the folder of notes Daniel had given me like it was a shield. My fear hadn't vanished, but something had shifted. The weight was no longer crushing me into silence. It was propelling me forward. That evening, I drove straight to the hardware store and bought new locks. As I stood in the aisle, scanning the options, I realized how symbolic it felt, choosing the barrier that would keep them out, not just physically but spiritually. They had crossed into my home without permission. Never again. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the shadows were long, and the first chill of night crept in. I carried the locks inside and set them on the table next to my notebook. Tomorrow I would call a security company about cameras. Tomorrow I would begin the log. Tomorrow I would reach out to Nora and the neighbors, humbly asking them to bear witness if the time came. For the first time in years, I felt the smallest flicker of confidence stir in my chest. They thought I was weak, forgetful, ready to surrender. But they were wrong. I had opened my eyes, and now I had allies. The locks on my doors were changed the following morning, and with each turn of the screwdriver, I felt a piece of my fear loosen its grip. Still, the silence in the house grew heavier by evening. I realized I could not spend the rest of my days sitting behind closed blinds, waiting for the next blow. Daniel's words echoed in my ears. I needed witnesses, allies, people who saw me clearly. That was when I thought of Nora. She had lived across the street for 30 years, a widow like me, her porch always filled with potted geraniums and her laughter carrying across the yard when friends gathered. I had waved to her often, but rarely stepped into her circle. That night I called. "Come tomorrow," she said gently. "The garden club is meeting here. We'll be glad to see you." I almost backed out in the morning, nerves buzzing in my stomach. But I forced myself to walk across the street with a plate of oatmeal cookies, my palms damp against the foil. Nora opened the door with her usual warmth, ushering me into a living room that smelled of lavender and coffee. 4 women were seated around the table, mugs in hand, eyes bright. Nora introduced them one by one. Alfreda, sharp and dignified in a blue scarf. Maria, soft-spoken, her dark hair pinned neatly back. And Carmen, whose booming laugh filled the room before I even shook her hand. "Ladies," Nora said, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder. "This is Marion Whitaker. She's been my neighbor forever, and she's family now." The word family struck me with a pang. I smiled as best I could and sat down. At first the talk was light. Gardens, aches in the knees, the rising cost of milk. But Nora, who knew me better than I thought, steered the conversation gently. "Marion's been going through some things with her son and his fiancée," she said, "and I think it would do her good to talk about it." All eyes turned to me. My throat tightened, but the kindness in their faces gave me courage. So I told them. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The engagement party that was invite only, the years of rent I had paid, the locks changed because they forced their way into my home. My voice shook as I spoke, and more than once I thought I might stop. But they leaned in, nodding, their silence full of understanding. When I finished, Carmen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You are not alone," she said firmly. "Don't you dare think you're alone." Maria's eyes shone with quiet sympathy. "My son did the same," she whispered. "Not the house, but the money. He borrowed, and when I finally said no, he called me selfish. He hasn't spoken to me in years, but I sleep better now than I did when I was feeding his habits." Elfrida, who had been listening with her chin resting on her hand, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but carried a warning edge. "You need to be careful. Families like that don't stop at guilt or tears. They create stories. They'll tell people you're senile, that you don't remember things. They'll try to prove it. I've seen it before with my cousin. They forged signatures on checks, then told the court she must have forgotten signing them." Her words chilled me because they rang too true. Brooke and Sloane had already hinted I was unstable. I thought of Mr. Fisher's calm suggestion of guardianship, and Elfrida's warning felt less like advice and more like prophecy. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "He told me to gather witnesses, people who know me, who can vouch for my clarity. Would you be willing?" Without hesitation, Nora straightened in her chair. "Of course," she said. "I'll stand by you, Marion. You've always been sharp as a tack. Anyone who says otherwise can deal with me first." "I will too," Maria added softly. "I see you every week at the market. You remember prices better than the cashier. If that's not clarity, I don't know what is." "And me," Carmen said. "I'll tell the judge myself if I have to." Even Elfrida, with her practical caution, gave me a nod. "Yes, I'll write a statement, but you must also protect yourself. Keep records, every detail. If they try to paint you as confused, let the facts drown them out." I swallowed hard, the weight in my chest easing for the first time in weeks. Their solidarity felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. I realized I had spent so many years giving to people who only saw me as a bank that I had forgotten what it felt like to be surrounded by women who expected nothing from me but honesty. Nora poured me another cup of coffee, her smile steady. "This is what we're here for. We've all carried burdens. Now we share them. That's how we get lighter." I sipped slowly, letting her words settle. Around that table, with laughter rising again and stories being swapped about stubborn grandchildren and overgrown rose bushes, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. Not the kind bought with money, not the kind dangled as a reward for sacrifice, but the kind rooted in shared scars and mutual respect. When I left Nora's house that afternoon, the autumn air felt crisper, the sky wider. I carried no documents, no cash transfers, no bargains made, but I carried something far stronger, a circle of witnesses, a sisterhood I hadn't known I needed. They could not fight the battle for me, but they could stand beside me while I fought. And that, I realized as I crossed back to my porch, was the first real victory. The phone rang early in the morning, its shrill sound slicing through the quiet of my kitchen. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth in my hands, when I saw Daniel Adler's name on the screen. My chest tightened. Lawyers don't call before 8 unless it's serious. I answered, bracing myself. "Marion," he said without preamble, his voice clipped and urgent. "They've filed. Brooke and Sloan have submitted a petition to the court declaring you mentally incompetent. They're requesting guardianship over you and your estate." For a moment the room spun. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the wood. "Guardianship?" I whispered. "They want to own me." "Not you," Daniel corrected grimly. "Your assets, but in legal terms, that's the same thing." I sank into the chair, every beat of my heart thudding louder than the last. After weeks of maneuvering, after lawyers and threats, they had finally shown their hand. Daniel spoke quickly, laying out the details. "They've included affidavits from your neighbor, Mr. Davis, and from your pharmacist, Mr. Green. Both claim you've been displaying erratic behavior, neglecting your health, and showing signs of confusion. They also attached supposed medical records suggesting you failed to fill critical prescriptions." My blood ran cold. "That's impossible," I said. "I don't have any prescriptions. I take vitamins and aspirin, that's all." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why it reeks of fabrication. But the documents look official. They claim you had unpaid bills and ignored doctors' recommendations. It's dangerous, Marion. Judges can be swayed if the paperwork looks credible." My mind flashed with fury. Brooke's careful handwriting on forms, Sloane's smug face behind some scheme, Ethan's silence, too weak to stand against them. They were building a case not from truth, but from lies, stacking it like a house of cards, and hoping the law would hold it upright. I forced my voice steady. "What about Mr. Green? He knows I don't take medication. He's been my pharmacist for years. Why would he say otherwise?" Daniel hesitated. "I called him already. He sounded shaken. He admitted Brooke came to him weeks ago, claiming she was worried about you. She asked questions about your purchases, then handed him a paper to sign. He thought it was for insurance. He didn't read the fine print." My stomach twisted. Manipulation. Brooke's specialty. She always knew how to use people's goodwill against them. "And Mr. Davis?" Daniel's sigh was heavy. "He filed a statement saying you've been paranoid, that you installed cameras, shouted at your family in the street, and allowed strangers into your home. From his perspective, those things look suspicious. He's not lying outright. He's just painting a distorted picture." I could see Davis in my mind's eye, standing across his porch with his arms crossed, frowning when my friends parked near his driveway. He never liked me. Now he had delivered exactly what Brooke needed, a veneer of legitimacy. I pressed my palms together and leaned my forehead against them, trying to find air in the storm swirling inside me. "So they've turned neighbors and professionals against me. They forged records. What's next, Daniel? How do I fight this?" "You stay calm," he said firmly. "This is their trap, but we won't step into it blindly. We'll gather your medical history, every receipt, every statement. We'll bring in your real witnesses, Nora, the garden club, Raj from the bank, and most importantly, we'll arrange a full psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Moore. Once we have that, we can dismantle their claims." The thought of being tested like a child made me bristle, but I knew he was right. Evidence against lies, facts against manipulation. "And the forged documents?" I asked. "How do we prove they're fake?" "We'll subpoena the providers," Daniel replied. "If there are no official records, it's perjury. Judges do not look kindly on manufactured evidence. But Marion," his tone softened, "you need to prepare yourself. They'll dig deep. They'll try to make every decision you've made look irrational, even your generosity to them." I let out a bitter laugh. I gave them $33,400 over 3 years. If that's irrational, then maybe the court should declare every mother in America incompetent. Daniel chuckled, though his voice stayed taut. "We'll use those numbers to show exactly the opposite, that you were fully capable, organized, and consistent. But you must understand, this will be ugly. Brooke has already crossed the line. They won't stop until they've tried everything. I closed my eyes, remembering Brooke's words in my living room. Everything you have will belong to us one day anyway. She hadn't just meant it as a cruel taunt. She had meant it as a plan. The fury that had been simmering since the day of the engagement party crystallized into something harder, colder. They thought they could corner me. They thought my age was weakness, my silence compliance, my kindness stupidity. But they had underestimated me. I lifted my head and spoke with a clarity that surprised even me. Daniel, then we fight. You tell me what to do, and I'll do it. I won't let them erase me from my own life. He exhaled audibly, relief in the sound. That's the Marion I know. Start today. Gather every piece of paper, bank statements, bills, correspondence. Write down every encounter with them, every phone call, every intrusion. We'll build a wall so high no lie can climb over it. I agreed. And after we hung up, I sat staring at my cold coffee. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and in the distance, I saw Brooke's car glide slowly past my house, just as it had the week before. She thought she was circling prey. She didn't know the prey had teeth. That afternoon, I pulled out a box of folders and began sorting. Each receipt, each bank slip, each note I had scribbled on torn envelopes. They were no longer memories of my foolish giving, but ammunition. I labeled and stacked, the clink of paper clips echoing in the room like the sound of armor being fastened. I wasn't just defending my assets. I was defending the truth. And I swore to myself that by the time this was over, every forged document, every false word, every calculated betrayal would lie exposed under the same bright light that now poured through my kitchen window. Daniel insisted we start with Mr. Green. I dreaded the encounter, not because I was angry with him, but because the thought of standing across from a man who had served me vitamins and aspirin for years, only to see his name on a document against me, was a wound I wasn't sure how to face. Still, I knew this wasn't the time to hide. So I walked with Daniel into the pharmacy that had been a part of my routine for decades, the bell above the door chiming in that familiar way. Mr. Green looked up from the counter, his face paling as soon as he saw me. He adjusted his glasses nervously, then straightened his white coat as if formality could shield him from the weight of what he had done. "Mrs. Whitaker," he stammered, I wasn't expecting—" "I imagine you weren't," Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk in private." The pharmacist nodded quickly and ushered us into the small consultation room at the back. My pulse raced as I sat across from him. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper. Daniel set a folder on the table but didn't open it yet. "Mr. Green," I began, keeping my voice steady, though my throat felt tight. "I need to hear it from you. Did you sign a statement saying I've been irregular with medication, that I ignored prescriptions?" He dropped his gaze. For a moment he said nothing, then exhaled heavily. "Yes, but I didn't know what I was signing. Brooke came in weeks ago, said she was worried about you. She asked about your purchases, about whether you filled prescriptions. I told her the truth. You only ever buy vitamins and aspirin, no regular medications. Then she handed me a paper. She said it was for insurance purposes, that she just needed confirmation. I signed without reading carefully." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you understand that statement was filed in court as evidence against my client? It claims she is incompetent." Mr. Green's face flushed red. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I would never—" "Mrs. Whitaker, you've been a loyal customer for years. You're sharp, you're precise, you know exactly what you're buying. I see that every time. I should never have trusted her word." I felt a mixture of anger and pity. Brooke's manipulation was her weapon, and Green had been another pawn. But this admission, painful as it was, could become strength in my defense. "Then you'll make it right," I said quietly. Yes, he nodded vigorously. I'll write a sworn affidavit. I'll state clearly that you have no regular prescriptions, that you manage your purchases yourself, that you're perfectly competent. I'll testify if I have to. Relief swelled in my chest. For the first time in days, I felt the scales tilt slightly back in my favor. Daniel clasped Green's shoulder and thanked him, reminding him of the seriousness of sworn statements. When we left, I caught Green's eyes once more. He looked guilty, but determined to repair the harm. Now, Daniel said as we stepped into the cool air outside, we face Mr. Davis. If Green had been a victim of manipulation, Davis was something else entirely. His hostility had been obvious for years, from the way he scowled when my friends parked in front of his house to the muttered comments about my garden hedges. I had long ago stopped expecting kindness from him. We crossed the street, my heart thudding as Daniel knocked on his door. Davis answered with his usual scowl, his thinning hair combed back, his arms crossed like a fortress. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Daniel spoke first. "Mr. Davis, we'd like to ask you about the affidavit you signed concerning Mrs. Whitaker's behavior." "I don't need to explain myself," Davis snapped. "I told the truth. She's been acting strange. Cameras everywhere, strangers coming and going, yelling at her family. Everyone sees it." My anger surged, but I held it down. "Mr. Davis," I said evenly, "those strangers are my friends. Nora, Maria, Carmen, women who drink tea and garden. The cameras were installed after my son and his fiancée broke into my home with a lawyer to pressure me. And the yelling? That was me telling them to leave when they tried to strip me of my rights." He snorted. "That's what you say now. But it looked off to me. I signed what I saw." Daniel's voice sharpened. "Did you personally witness Mrs. Whitaker forget conversations, fail to recognize people, lose track of her finances?" Davis shifted uneasily, but didn't answer directly. "I just know what I saw. It was enough." "No," Daniel said firmly. "What you signed was not about vague impressions. It was framed as evidence of incompetence. If you exaggerated or allowed your bias to color the truth, that's perjury." For the first time, Davis faltered. His eyes darted from me to Daniel. "I don't like the noise, the people, the drama across the street. That's what I signed for. I didn't think it would go this far." I met his gaze steadily. "Your dislike of me is not incompetence. Your annoyance is not truth. You've lived across from me for 30 years. You know I drive myself to the store. You've seen me balance my checkbook on the porch. You've borrowed tools from me, and I always remembered to ask for them back. Tell me honestly, Davis, have you ever once seen me confused about who you are?" His jaw tightened, but he looked away. "No," he muttered finally. Silence stretched between us. Daniel took a step closer, his tone lower but heavier. "Then understand, sir. If this goes to court, you'll be cross-examined. If you admit under oath what you just admitted here, that you based your affidavit on irritation and assumptions, not facts, you could face serious consequences. Think carefully before you put yourself further into Brooke's game." Davis glared, but the fight had gone out of him. He muttered something about not wanting trouble and closed the door with a thud. As Daniel and I walked back toward my house, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. We had gained an affidavit from Green, and though Davis's hostility remained, his credibility was cracked. "You did well," Daniel said. "Green will help us. Davis won't be as dangerous once a judge hears his bias." I nodded, the cool breeze brushing my face. They wanted to paint me as a confused old woman, but every lie they tell, every person they manipulate, only proves how clear I really am. Daniel came by that afternoon with a portable scanner and a stack of colored sticky flags. the kind that make a desk look like a field of bright markers. I had already pulled 3 boxes down from the hall closet, files that Robert and I once organized together on winter evenings, our mugs of cocoa leaving faint rings on the cardboard lids. Time had softened the edges of the folders, but the labels were still neat in Robert's handwriting. Home, insurance, estate, beach house. My hands shook when I touched that last one. "Let's start there," Daniel said gently, sensing where my mind had gone. He opened the beach house folder and laid the contents on the table with careful, almost reverent fingers. Deed copies, tax statements, insurance renewal letters, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope with a blue heron embossed on the flap. I remembered it the moment I saw it. I had chosen that stationery because of the birds that nested near the dunes, their thin legs cutting quiet paths across the sand at dusk. Robert had smiled when I brought it home. "Blue herons know when to stand still," he'd said. "They wait, then strike at the right moment." Daniel slit the seal and slid out a sheaf of documents clipped together. He scanned the first page silently, then nodded once. "Here we are. The Blue Heron Trust." The words landed with a clarity that pushed the breath from my chest. Robert and I had created it a decade ago, guided by a financial planner who liked to talk more about values than numbers. We had wanted the beach house protected from rash decisions, from family pressure, from the kind of crisis that could end with a for sale sign stuck in the sand. We had wanted to keep it whole, either for me to live in or one day for a purpose larger than ourselves. Daniel flattened the trust document and read aloud key provisions, pen tapping lightly as he went. Revocable while both settlers were alive. After Robert's death, revocable by you alone. Trustee. Initially both of you. Now you, with a corporate successor named. Restrictions on conveyance without co-trustee consent if a question of capacity arises. He paused, eyes sharpening. "And here's the anchor clause." He slid the page toward me and pointed. "Charitable remainder. Upon Marion Whitaker's death, the beach house and its proceeds shall pass to the Coastal Resilience Fund for shoreline conservation and senior access programs." My fingertips found the margin where Robert had written, in his tidy engineer's script, "A house should keep giving when we're gone." I felt heat rise behind my eyes. "So it was never truly meant for Ethan," I said quietly. "Not as a possession." "It was meant to care for you, then serve a purpose you and Robert believed in," Daniel replied. "Ethan could have been part of that story in 100 ways, memories, time, stewardship. But title? No, not unless you amended it, which you didn't." I thought of Brooke at the locked door, texting me as if I had simply mailed the wrong key. She had assumed the path to the house ran through me like an open hallway. No locks, no gates, no history. All she needed was Ethan's acquiescence and time. But there was another door entirely, one she didn't know existed, paper and ink, and Robert's quiet foresight. Daniel kept reading. "The deed transferring title from you and Robert to the trust was recorded with the county in 2014, he said. "That means the house hasn't been in your personal name for years. Guardianship over your person or your non-trust assets wouldn't automatically capture it. To control the trust, they'd have to remove you as trustee, and the document requires 2 licensed physicians to certify incapacity, plus the corporate successor must concur." He looked up, a faint smile in his eyes. "It's a fortress." I exhaled slowly, a tremor leaving my shoulders. "Robert always said he wanted me safe," I murmured. "He knew I might forget to protect myself." "He didn't think you were weak," Daniel said. "He thought you were generous, and generosity without guardrails invites wolves." He flagged several sections and fed the documents through his scanner. The machine hummed, making tidy digital ghosts of every page. We worked quietly for a while, sorting, scanning, labeling. Outside, late light slanted across the maple leaves, and the house felt unusually still, as if it too were listening. When we reached the pour-over will, another safeguard directing any stray assets into the trust at death, Daniel tapped it with his pen. This closes loopholes. Even if they convince someone you had promised them the house, the will moves everything back here. Intention is consistent in every document. A memory rose, an August evening at the beach house when the tide clock on the porch ticked toward high water. Robert and I sat with our feet up, the air salted and warm. "If Ethan marries someone who loves the ocean," I had said, "we'll have them here for summers. Teach their children the tide names." Robert squeezed my hand. "If he marries someone who loves money more than the ocean," he'd replied, "we'll let the herons keep watch." I had laughed then, not understanding how precisely he was drawing our future. "I wish he could see this," I said, tapping the heron seal. "I wish I had asked more questions while he was alive." "He's in every line," Daniel said, "and you are too. You picked the bird." We turned to the last section, an inventory schedule listing the house address, the parcel number, insurance policy references. Daniel compared the policy to the deed and trust, checking that all three named the same owner. "Clean," he pronounced. "Very clean. Whoever advised you did excellent work." "Robert listened," I said. I deferred. "You partnered," he corrected. "Now it's time to finish the work he started." Before he left, Daniel compiled a packet: the trust, the recorded deed, the will, the insurance confirmations, and a short memo explaining in plain language why the beach house is not reachable through a standard guardianship. He slid it into a folder and wrote, in block letters on the tab, "Blue Heron, keep close." "At the hearing," he said, "I'll walk the judge through this. I won't lead with it, but when Brooke hints at real estate, we'll be ready." The more they reveal their appetite, the clearer their motive becomes. "Motive," I repeated, tasting the word. "They'll think I'm cruel." "They already do," he said gently. "But we're not here to convince them. We're here to convince the law, and to remind you that you are not a vault to be cracked. You are a person to be respected." After he left, I sat alone at the table with the heron envelope in my hands. I traced the bird's outline, remembering how it stands ankle-deep, perfectly still, until the moment calls for decisive motion. That had been my mistake for years. I mistook stillness for surrender. I thought love required me to hold my breath forever. I placed the folder in the safe, turned the dial, and listened for the click. As the tumbler settled, I understood Brooke's message about the keys in a new way. The keys she wanted would never fit, not because I had sent the wrong set, but because the door she was rattling opened to something she could not see. The house was made of wood and windows and salt, but it was also made of promise, and promises, once forged well, are hard to pick. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. I walked in beside Daniel, my heart steady, but my hands clenched around the small leather bag Robert had given me years ago. It held nothing useful for court, just a pressed blue heron feather I'd found on the beach. But I wanted it with me. Ethan sat with Brooke and Sloan across the aisle, their lawyer Fisher already shuffling papers with the confidence of a man who thought the outcome had been bought and paid for. Judge Miller entered, and the room fell silent. Fisher stood first. His voice carried that professional sympathy lawyers wear like a mask. "Your Honor, we present ample evidence that Mrs. Whitaker has suffered a significant decline in judgment and cognition. Affidavits from her neighbor, Mr. Davis, and her pharmacist, Mr. Green, confirm erratic behavior, neglected prescriptions, and paranoia. We also provide medical records indicating missed appointments and unfilled prescriptions." He laid the folder down with a flourish, glancing at me as though I were already a ward of the court. Daniel rose slowly, adjusting his tie. His voice was quiet, but cut through the air like glass. "Your Honor, What you have just heard is a carefully constructed illusion. Today we will demonstrate that these so-called facts are distortions, some manufactured entirely, designed not to protect Mrs. Whitaker, but to plunder her estate. We will not only disprove incompetence, we will expose deliberate fraud. The judge nodded, his eyes sharp. Proceed. Fisher called Brooke first. She walked to the witness stand in a black dress, tears glistening perfectly on cue. Marion has always been like a second mother to me, she said softly. But in the past year she's changed. She refuses our calls. She installed cameras all over her house, and she lashes out without reason. We're terrified she's being manipulated by strangers. Her voice cracked, and Ethan passed her a tissue. Daniel rose for cross-examination. Mrs. Carter, when was the last time you visited my client without asking for financial assistance? Brooke blinked. We always talked about many things. A specific date? Daniel pressed. She faltered. I don't remember. Then let me remind you, Daniel said, producing printouts. Every communication in the last 18 months was about rent, car payments, or money. Not one message simply asked how she was. Would you also remind the court whether you invited her to your engagement party? Brooke's face stiffened. It was a small gathering. Daniel's voice sharpened. Did you or did you not say to her directly, it was invite only, only special people came? Her cheeks flushed. Those words were taken out of context. What context? Daniel asked softly. Makes them less cruel. Brooke's lips pressed tight, and Daniel sat down. Fisher called Mr. Davis next. He puffed up his chest as if finally given a stage. She yells at people in the street. She has cameras like she's under siege, and she lets strangers come and go. Daniel approached him slowly. Mr. Davis, have you ever seen my client forget your name? No. Lose her way in the neighborhood? No. Fail to pay her bills? Well, not that I know of. Then your statement that she is incompetent is based on annoyance, not fact, isn't it? Davis bristled but said nothing. The judge scribbled notes. Then came Mr. Green. His face was pale as he swore the oath. Fisher began confidently. Mr. Green, did you sign a statement about Mrs. Whitaker's irregular medication habits? I did, Green admitted, his voice low. And you stand by it? Green hesitated, then looked at me, guilt heavy in his eyes. No, I was misled. Brooke Carter came to me saying she was worried. She asked me to sign a paper for insurance. I thought I was confirming she only purchased vitamins. I never said she neglected prescriptions, because she never had any. Gasps rippled through the room. Fisher jumped up. Objection, Your Honor! But Judge Miller silenced him with a look. Daniel stepped forward. Mr. Green, will you tell the court in your own words whether Mrs. Whitaker is competent in her purchases? She is, he said firmly. She knows exactly what she buys. She is sharper than most customers I see. Daniel nodded. Thank you. No further questions. Fisher's confidence began to crack, but he tried to regain ground by submitting the so-called medical records. That was when Daniel called our last witness, Ava Chen, a forensic document examiner with a steady gaze and precise tone. She laid the records on the projector and enlarged the pharmacist's alleged signature. Your Honor, she began, this signature is presented as Mr. Green's. I have compared it against his verified signatures on file. There are significant discrepancies, pressure points, stroke direction, spacing. In my expert opinion, this signature was forged. Murmurs spread through the courtroom like a current. Ava turned to the next page. Additionally, the document header contains formatting inconsistent with any known medical provider in this county. It appears to be a template altered digitally. The metadata confirms it was generated from a personal computer less than 2 months ago. The judge's eyebrows lifted. Fisher sputtered, "This is outrageous!" Daniel stood, his voice controlled but burning. "Outrageous indeed, Your Honor. Outrageous that a son and his fiancée would fabricate evidence to strip an elderly woman of her rights. Outrageous that they would manipulate neighbors and professionals. Outrageous that they would call her paranoid while committing fraud in plain sight." I felt my breath steady, a wave of clarity washing over me. The lies were unraveling in front of everyone. Fisher tried to recover by calling Ethan, but my son's testimony was a hollow echo. He mumbled about stress, about concern, but when Daniel asked how much money I had given him over 3 years, he had no answer. When asked if he had ever visited me without asking for money, his silence was the loudest sound in the room. Finally, Judge Miller leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I have heard enough for today. This case is not about protecting Mrs. Whitaker. It is about exploiting her. The affidavits presented by the petitioners are tainted. The medical evidence is fabricated. The petition for guardianship is denied." The gavel struck, sharp and final. My knees trembled, but I stood tall. Across the aisle, Brooke's face twisted in fury. Sloane's jaw clenched. Ethan looked down at his hands as though they were strangers. Daniel placed a steady hand on my shoulder. As we left the courtroom, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt like a baptism. I was not just walking out as a woman who had defended her sanity. I was walking out as someone who had remembered her worth, who had turned stillness into strength, and who now knew the battle was no longer about survival. It was about living freely. There is a moment from the hearing that keeps returning to me, not the gavel or the murmurs, but a silence so complete it seemed to rearrange the air. It began when Judge Miller leaned forward and regarded my son with a patience that felt like a mirror. "Mr. Whitaker," he asked, voice even, "how many times in the past year have you visited your mother without asking her for money?" Ethan swallowed. His eyes flicked to Brooke, then to the table, then to his hands spread flat as if he were trying to calm a restless animal. He didn't speak. The court reporter's keys paused, waiting for words that didn't come. Brooke shifted in her chair and touched his elbow, a light nudge that said, "Say something useful." Sloane's jaw was set, lips a thin white line. I watched Ethan's throat work, watched a blush climb over his cheekbones, the way fevers used to bloom when he was small. He glanced up once and caught me looking at him. The eye contact lasted a single heartbeat. Then his gaze fell again. "Mr. Whitaker," Judge Miller prompted, not unkindly, "a number will do." He could have said one. He could have said 3, 5, any lie that might have preserved pride. Instead, he remained very still, and I heard a faint, hollow sound in the room, as if something inside me had knocked once and then gone quiet. Ethan's silence wasn't defiance. It was vacancy. It said more than any speech he could have rehearsed. In that pause, an older scene opened in me. A rainy Sunday kitchen, pancakes spitting butter in the pan, Ethan at 8 dragging a chair to the counter to reach the mixing bowl. "You're the best mom," he declared between mouthfuls, syrup on his chin, a crayon drawing tucked under his arm. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, a lopsided blue heart hovering above us. He insisted on taping it to the refrigerator. For weeks, I straightened it like a holy picture. He carried that phrase around for years, the best mom, tossing it into ordinary moments like confetti. The judge let the quiet stretch just long enough to become honest. "Let the record reflect," he said gently, "that the witness does not answer." And for an instant I considered rescuing him, filling the space with something merciful. "He's been busy, Your Honor. Life is hard. But truth has its own dignity, and I had learned at last not to pad it with excuses." The court reporter resumed typing, capturing nothing and capturing everything. Ethan tried to recover. Work has been..." he began, and then stopped, because even his evasions had nowhere to land. Daniel didn't press. He simply looked at the judge, letting the absence speak. Brooke's fingers tightened around Ethan's sleeve, a small command disguised as reassurance. I had tied 1,000 shoelaces for that hand, kissed scrapes off those knuckles, tucked them into mittens on winter mornings. Now they lay open on the rail as if surrendering to gravity. When the witnesses were dismissed for a recess, I remained seated. Ethan stood a few rows ahead of me, half turned as though he might approach. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did as a teenager when he'd broken a rule and wasn't ready to confess. He lifted his head, looked my way again, then let it drop. Brooke spoke low into his ear. Whatever she said pulled him back into their circle. He didn't come. I don't know what was written on his face then. Shame, confusion, maybe the late dawning of consequence. What I do know is that grief can feel like housekeeping. You pick up what can be salvaged, stack what must be let go, and refuse to call the sorting heartlessness. I mourned the boy who made pancakes with me and insisted my picture hang on the fridge. I mourned the man who, when asked for a simple account of love, found only silence. Judge Miller returned and the proceedings moved on, but something had shifted inside me. The anger I had been carrying thinned into a steadier sorrow. Anger shouts, sorrow listens. In that courtroom, listening became a form of witness. I listened to the story his quiet was telling, that he had spent a year, or longer, measuring affection in deposits, trading visits for transfers, letting our relationship calcify around the ritual of asking and giving. Once the giving ended, he didn't know how to arrive. When the judge delivered his decision later, I felt relief, yes, and a clean brightness I hadn't felt in years. Yet the memory that lingered was not the denial of the petition, nor the exposure of forgery, but the way Ethan's mouth opened and then closed again. If a relationship has an obituary, perhaps it is written in the moment a son cannot think of a time he came just to sit at his mother's table. That evening, back home, I made tea and opened the small tin where I keep odd treasures. Paper clips, a dried sprig of lavender, and a folded piece of paper worn soft with years. I unfolded the drawing, the one with the blue heart, and the words printed carefully in a child's determined hand, "Best Mom." The tape marks were still in the corners where I'd once fixed it to the refrigerator. I set it on the table and let the kettle sing. I didn't cry. The tears had already been spent in other rooms, for other endings. I simply looked and remembered the boy who said it and the woman who believed him. If Ethan ever speaks that way again, it will be because he chooses to, not because I've paid the toll. Until then, I will honor the truth that silence delivered in court. It was not a punishment. It was an answer. It told me what I needed to know about where to stand, how to open the door of my life without erasing my threshold, how to keep the part of me that once made pancakes alive without inviting the old transaction back in. Later, when the house settled and the porch light clicked on, I slid the drawing into a fresh sleeve, not to archive the past, but to protect something tender that had survived it. The room was quiet. The quiet felt earned. In it, I could hear a different sentence forming, one I spoke to myself out loud to make sure it would hold. You were a good mother. You are a good woman. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let a silence stand. Judge Miller's gavel came down once, not as a command for silence, but as a marker that the end of something heavy was finally here. He leaned forward, his glasses low on his nose, his eyes sharp and calm in the same breath. I gripped the table in front of me, my knuckles white against the polished wood, waiting to hear whether I still belonged to myself. This court has reviewed the petition for guardianship over Mrs. Marion Whitaker, Judge Miller began, his voice measured, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of a stone placed carefully in its place. The petitioners presented affidavits, alleged medical evidence, and testimony designed to demonstrate incompetence. However, upon examination, this evidence has been shown to be unreliable, misleading, and in some instances, fraudulent. I felt the room tilt toward me, every breath in the gallery suspended. Brooke's face froze into its practiced mask of concern, though her eyes betrayed a flash of panic. Sloane shifted in her seat, the lines of her mouth pulled taut. Ethan sat very still, his shoulders caved inward, his gaze locked on the floor. Judge Miller continued, "We heard from Mr. Green, the pharmacist, who testified he was deceived into signing a document under false pretenses. We heard from a forensic examiner who established that at least one signature was forged and that certain documents were fabricated. We heard from Mr. Davis, whose testimony under cross-examination revealed personal bias rather than factual evidence of incapacity. The court cannot and will not ignore these facts." His voice hardened as he looked across at Brooke and Sloane. "Let this stand as a reminder that elder financial abuse is not only immoral, but criminal. Courts will not serve as tools for those who exploit trust and twist family ties for personal gain. Such conduct will be referred, where appropriate, for further scrutiny." The words struck like a clean wind cutting through stale air. For weeks I had been bracing under suspicion, painted as fragile, as confused, as less than whole. Now, before everyone, the truth was spoken into the record. I was intact. "Therefore," Judge Miller said, his gavel lifted once more, "the petition for guardianship is hereby denied. Mrs. Whitaker retains full legal capacity over her person and her estate." The sound of the gavel landing this time was final. A release, a door unlatched. My breath left me in a rush, my hands trembling against the table. Daniel leaned close and whispered, "It's over, Marion. You've won." But it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a deep, aching relief, as though shackles I hadn't realized were digging into my skin had been cut away. I sat taller, my spine straightening with a dignity I thought I had lost somewhere between the unpaid rent checks and the cruel laughter at an invite-only engagement party. I turned my head just enough to catch Brooke's eyes. She was looking at me with something colder than anger. It was hatred sharpened by disbelief, as if she could not fathom that the woman she dismissed as weak had found her footing and spoken her truth aloud. Her lips pressed into a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. If venom could be bottled in a look, hers would have filled the room. Sloane muttered something under her breath, her nails tapping the table in sharp staccato. The fight she thought she had won had slipped from her hands, and now she was left with nothing but rage. And Ethan, my son, he did not look at me. Not when the judge spoke, not when the gavel struck, not even when Daniel began packing up our papers with the ease of a man who knew justice had been done. Ethan sat as though bound by chains of his own making. When he did finally raise his head, just for a moment, I saw something flicker there. Not defiance, not even anger, but something closer to sorrow. A shadow of recognition, as if the weight of his choices had finally begun to land. His eyes met mine briefly, and I remembered the boy who once taped a blue heart to the refrigerator. For a second, I thought I saw that boy again, but the moment passed, and his gaze fell back to the table. The judge rose, and the bailiff called the session closed. People shuffled out, murmuring, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind their hands. I remained seated, letting the current of their movement wash past me. Daniel touched my arm lightly. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm, but I knew he too felt the victory like a clean breath. I stood slowly, gathering my bag. The feather inside shifted as though reminding me of the heron's lesson, stillness until the right moment. I had waited, endured, and when it mattered, I had struck with truth. As I walked out of the courtroom, the light streaming in from the tall windows hit my face, bright and warm. It felt like stepping out of a cage. My steps were steady, my heart unburdened. Behind me, I could hear Brooke's sharp whisper to Ethan, the sound of frustration disguised as command. But those words no longer held me. They belonged to her world, not mine. I was free, not just free of their petition, but free of the lie that I was only valuable as a wallet, as a vault to be opened. Judge Miller had given me back more than my rights. He had given me back my reflection, reminding me that I was still Marion Whittaker, a woman who remembered her strength. Outside, the air smelled of cut grass and faint exhaust from passing cars. Daniel walked beside me, silent, respectful of the moment. I inhaled deeply, feeling every breath as if it were my first after surfacing from deep water. The courthouse doors closed behind me, and with them, the echo of chains falling away. That Saturday, my dining table looked different than it had in years. Instead of papers spread across it like battle plans, there were plates, glasses, and vases of fresh hydrangeas cut from the backyard. I had roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, mashed potatoes whipped until they held the imprint of the spoon, and a pie cooling on the counter that smelled like cinnamon and autumn afternoons. I lit candles not for romance or ritual, but because soft light made everything feel gentler, less marked by the shadows of what I had been through. When the doorbell rang, my heart gave a little flutter. Nora stood there first, holding a basket of bread she'd baked herself, the crust still warm. Behind her came Alfreda with a bottle of red wine, Carmen with a tray of empanadas, and Maria balancing a bowl of salad bursting with tomatoes from her garden. They filed in with laughter and the kind of ease that fills a home more quickly than any decoration could. As we settled around the table, I realized it had been a long time since my house had held voices that didn't argue over money or demand more than I had to give. Instead, these women gave without asking. Nora reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "To Marion," she said, "to weathering storms and reminding us all how strong we can be." The others raised their glasses, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame this time, but from a shy kind of gratitude. We ate slowly, savoring both food and company. Alfreda told a story about how her grandson had tried to plant sunflowers in her living room because he didn't want to wait for spring. Carmen made us laugh until tears rolled down our cheeks, describing her attempts to learn how to salsa dance at 70. Maria talked about her childhood in Mexico, how her mother used to press tortillas with nothing but her palms, and the memory made her eyes shine. As I listened, I felt something open in me, like a window that had been stuck for too long. The room was filled with warmth that asked for nothing in return. They weren't here because of what I owned or what I could provide. They weren't calculating the worth of my beach house or my savings account. They were here because they saw me, not as an obstacle, not as a source of income, but as a woman who had lived and still had more to live. I thought of Ethan then, of the silence in the courtroom when he couldn't name a single visit that wasn't tied to money. That silence had cut deep, but now it felt less like a wound and more like a scar, one that no longer bled, but still reminded me of where I had been. My son had chosen his path, and I had chosen to stop being trampled on it. Now I was discovering that family wasn't limited to bloodlines. It could be chosen in laughter, in kindness, in the way women pass bread around a table without keeping score. At one point, Nora leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, Marion, sometimes it takes losing what we thought was permanent to realize what was waiting all along. You're not alone. Not now. Not ever." Her words sank deep, wrapping around the parts of me that had felt hollow for too long. After dessert, we lingered with coffee and tea. No one hurried to leave. The conversation drifted from gardens to books to memories of youth. But beneath it all, was a steady undercurrent. We had all known loss, betrayal, and disappointment, and yet we had arrived here together. That shared knowledge made the air feel sacred. As the evening drew to a close, we stood in the doorway, reluctant to break the spell. Carmen hugged me tightly. "This house feels alive again," she whispered. Maria kissed my cheek and promised to bring over cuttings from her roses. Alfreda wagged her finger with mock sternness and said, "You'd better save me a slice of that pie next time." And Nora, before stepping out into the night, looked at me with eyes that had seen decades of my life. "You've always had a family, Marion. Sometimes it just takes time to see who they are." When the door finally closed and the house grew quiet, I walked back into the dining room. The table was a mess of crumbs, half-empty glasses, and the lingering scent of roasted chicken. But I didn't rush to clean it. I wanted to let it sit, to let the memory root itself in every corner of the room. For the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, wrapped in the echo of voices that reminded me I wasn't walking forward alone. I looked out the window toward the garden, where the hydrangeas glowed faintly in the moonlight. It struck me then that the word alone had always been sharper in my head than in reality. Tonight had proven otherwise. Tonight had shown me that I had a new family, one I hadn't expected but desperately needed. Family that chose me as much as I chose them. And in that realization, I felt the faint but certain shift of a new chapter beginning. The morning was cool when I drove to the cemetery, the kind of cool that makes you breathe deeper without noticing. I brought a thermos of coffee, a small brush, a damp cloth, and an envelope tucked into my purse. The groundskeeper had trimmed the grass recently. The air smelled faintly of cut green and damp earth. I found Robert's stone under the maple we chose together years ago, the same tree that turns the color of burnished copper every fall. I knelt and brushed away a scatter of leaves, tracing his name with my thumb, the way I used to trace the worry line between his brows. "Good morning," I said, because it felt right to keep our old habits. "I have a lot to tell you." I wiped the stone clean, rinsed the cloth and the thermos cap, and went slowly, the way he taught me to do everything that mattered, one deliberate action at a time. When the letters were clean and the dates shone a little darker, I sat on the small folding chair I'd brought and opened the envelope. The paper inside was lined, the kind I always preferred for letters, and the top line read, in my neatest handwriting, "Dear Robert." "I suppose I could speak without paper," I said aloud, smiling at myself, "but you always liked a record." I read as I spoke. I told him about asking Ethan and Brooke when the engagement party would be, and hearing, "We celebrated last weekend, invite only." I told him how small I felt standing in my own kitchen, and how my body remembered to be graceful while my heart broke like glass. I told him about the green dress hanging untouched in the closet, the one I bought believing I belonged in our son's photographs. I admitted the numbers I had finally written down, the $33,400 that turned from generosity into a ledger of loss the moment I saw it in ink. I told him about Brooke's message. "The keys to your 1.3 MI beach house don't fit. Did you send the wrong ones?" And how the absurdity of it steadied me. I told him I typed, "Wait, you didn't know?" and felt for the first time in years the ground under my feet. I described the day I drove to the bank and canceled the transfers, how Raj stamped the paper and slid it to me, and how light I felt walking back to the car with nothing but my own name in my hands. I told him they came to the house, their lawyer in a gray suit, their folder of forms, their careful, practiced voices. I told him I dropped the papers into the trash and said no, the way I should have said it 1,000 small times before. I confessed I was shaking afterward, and then I confessed I laughed. He would have liked that part. I described Daniel Adler's office, the smell of cedar, the shelves of books, and the way he said the words I had not let myself say, elder financial abuse. I told Robert about the plan: change the locks, install cameras, keep a log, find witnesses. I told him I carried a plate of oatmeal cookies across the street to Nora's house and met the women who sat me at a table and handed me my courage in small, warm pieces. I told him about Alfreda's warning and Maria's soft voice and Carmen's laugh that rinsed the ache from my ribs like clear water. I told him how quickly the legal trap sprang, how Daniel called at dawn to say they'd filed for guardianship, how my stomach dropped when I heard Mr. Green and Mr. Davis had signed statements, how I felt both foolish and furious that Brooke had turned decent people into scaffolding for a lie. I told him Daniel and I went to the pharmacy and Mr. Green's hand shook as he admitted he'd been tricked and how he promised to write the truth this time. I told him we knocked on Mr. Davis's door and heard irritation dressed as certainty and how even that would lose its shape under questions. I told him about the boxes I pulled from our closet, the file labeled Beach House, the blue heron seal we chose because he said herons know when to stand still. I told him Daniel flattened the trust on the table and tapped the clause we wrote together, the one that said the house would serve me first and then the shore, and the seniors who needed the ocean to remind them of their lives. I told him his signature felt like a hand on my shoulder, steadying me again. I told him about the courtroom, the wood polished by 1,000 anxious palms, the murmur that swells and falls like a tide. I told him how Brooke's voice trembled on cue and how the examiner, Ava Chen, enlarged the pharmacist's signature and spoke calmly about pressure points and forged lines. I told him how Judge Miller said the words I needed most. Petition denied. I told him how when the judge asked Ethan how many times he had visited without asking for money, our son had no answer. I didn't say it cruelly. I said it as a witness. Silence is also a kind of truth. I folded the first pages of the letter under and wrote more. I am free, I read aloud, and the words surprised me with how simple they sounded. Not young, not beginning from nothing, but free enough to choose what remains. I told him I had held a dinner for the women who now felt like kin, that we passed bread and stories, and nothing in the room had a price tag. I told him the house felt alive again when they left, and the quiet afterward was the good kind. I promised him I would live the life we sketched in rough pencil and then set aside. I promised to drive to the beach on weekdays when the crowds are thin and the light is kind. I promised to let the porch fill with books and small plants and conversations that drift into comfortable hush. I promised to volunteer with the very program the house will one day fund, to walk slower people down the boardwalk and let them lean on my arm while the gulls argue overhead. I promised to forgive myself for the years I mistook giving for belonging. I promised to forgive Ethan in time, not for his sake, but for mine, because forgiveness would keep me from carrying what isn't mine. Then I slipped a second envelope from my purse, heavier, legal paper folded tight, and laid it at the base of the stone. For you, I said softly. A copy of the Blue Heron Trust. You kept your promise. Now I'll keep mine. The wind moved across the grass and lifted the corner just enough for me to slide a small flat stone over it, the way I've seen in cemeteries where people mark that they came and remembered. I poured a little coffee into the cap and set it beside the flowers. For the road, I joked, and felt the warmth of his old laugh in my chest. The maple above us rustled. I closed my eyes and listened. I didn't ask for signs. I didn't need them. Love sometimes speaks in very ordinary weather. When I stood, my knees protested the way they do now, and I smiled because this too is living, stretching, steadying, choosing again and again. I touched the top of the stone once more. I am all right, I said. I am free. Then I added the part that felt most like prayer. I will carry the good forward. On the walk back to the car, I turned once to look at the maple and the neat rectangle of grass. The envelope with the heron claws lay tucked against his name like a thank you. The air smelled of cuttings and early sun. I breathed it in and let it out slowly. The day waited, unclaimed, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like mine. 3 months later, I found myself standing in an apartment that smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. The movers had just left, and the boxes were stacked neatly against the wall, each one labeled in my careful handwriting. The space wasn't large: 2 bedrooms, a balcony that caught the afternoon sun, a kitchen that looked out on the city skyline, but it was enough, more than enough. For the first time in years, every inch belonged to me. No echoes of raised voices, no footsteps pacing with expectation, no waiting for the next request. Just quiet, clean air, and the steady sound of my own breath. I had sold the house where so much of the conflict unfolded. Not the beach house, that trust would stand longer than me, but the old family home with its memories and its shadows. Letting it go was less painful than I expected. As I signed the closing papers, I realized that walls only hold what we allow them to. I was ready to carry forward only what served me. The proceeds from the sale I divided in 2. Half went to a foundation dedicated to protecting seniors from financial exploitation. The other half I kept for what Robert would have called living forward. The first thing I did was book a trip. Just a short one, a train ride up the coast to a town I had always meant to visit, but never had the time for. I walked cobblestone streets, tasted seafood caught that morning, and watched the sun sink into the horizon from a bench where no one knew my name. I felt light. Not young, not new, but light, in the way a burdened tree feels after a storm has pruned its branches. When I came back, I signed up for volunteer shifts at the senior center. The first afternoon, I poured coffee for a woman in her 80s who told me about her days as a nurse during the war. I listened as if the stories were gold, because in many ways, they were. The center director asked if I could help with the fundraising committee, and I agreed, knowing my experience with paperwork and persistence might finally serve something beyond the narrow corridors of family drama. At night, Nora visited. We ate simple dinners on the balcony, listening to the city hum below us. She teased me about my new potted plants, already lined up like green soldiers, and promised to keep me company when I felt restless. "You're building a new life, Marian," she said, lifting her glass of iced tea, "and this time, it's one you chose." Her words stayed with me. Choice. That was the difference. For decades, I gave out of obligation, from a place of fear that love could only be maintained if I kept paying its rent. Now I gave because I wanted to, and I kept what I needed without apology. One evening, while sorting through a stack of mail, I found an envelope addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in months. Ethan's. My heart paused as I slid it open carefully, bracing for anger, accusation, another demand thinly disguised as concern. But inside was only a single page, the words few, the ink pressed harder in some places, as though hesitation lived in every stroke. "Mom," it began, "are you okay?" No apology, no admission. No acknowledgement of courtrooms or affidavits or the ledger of years. Just that question. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter spread open, my tea cooling beside me. The words were not enough to repair anything, but they were not nothing either. I thought of the boy with pancake batter on his cheeks, who called me the best mom. I thought of the man in the courtroom who could not find a single memory of visiting without asking for money. Both were my son. Both were real. The letter was his bridge, or maybe just his hesitation, but it was his. I smiled then, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with something softer. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in a drawer. I did not write back. Some silences are not cruel, they are boundaries. My silence was my answer. I was okay. More than okay. I was free. That night, I stepped onto the balcony, the city lights stretching like constellations, and felt the air brush cool against my skin. I raised my glass in a quiet toast, to Robert, to Nora, to the women who became my chosen family, to the heron standing still until it struck, to myself, most of all. The life ahead was not guaranteed to be smooth, but it was mine. And after all the battles, the betrayals, the courtroom reckonings, that truth was the greatest gift.